I'm going to introduce our new Senior Vice President of Automotive, Mobile, and Emerging, Hybert, to the stage to do an official welcome. Everybody, Hybert.
Thank you very much, and I think that is actually the right intro. I've been with Western Digital for a good week and a half, and in my second day, my boss said we have this big event coming up for automotive, and go, talk, enjoy, and hang out with the people there. So here I am. I want to certainly welcome you, and certainly with our partner Wired, welcome you to this event. I saw a lot of people already having a good time in the parking lot with a vehicle, with drinks, after being in the parking lot with a vehicle. I appreciate also the fact that you guys went through the worst rush hour traffic, probably timing-wise. We deliberately picked this time so you will appreciate the self-driving car even more in the future. As you can imagine with Western Digital, right, we take data and data-driven very, very seriously. And this event certainly brings together a number of experts on panels who can talk not just about data, but the future of autonomous vehicles, the future of connected vehicles. These people may not all align, but we certainly will have a cross-section of questions and discussions about policy, about business, about technology. I think that will certainly be something where my personal question of if you look in a vehicle today, the amount of data that is generated already in the vehicle, how is that going to play out? Not just selfishly from a Western Digital perspective, how is this going to be stored and transmitted, but also what do we do with privacy? How does this play with safety? How does it play with entertainment as the car is now driving itself? Right? You're sitting into a 4,000-pound entertainment vehicle at some point. How does this all work? So I'm certainly looking forward to the discussion on that topic. I think it is somewhat unpredictable exactly where this discussion will go, and I think it's set up specifically not to be a scripted question and answer session. So, as was already mentioned, after this program, please look at the immersive experience behind the black wall. Please stay, connect, enjoy the rest of the day, and connect with other people. I think that's what these events certainly are also for. At this point, I would like to introduce Alex Davies, who is a transportation editor for Wired. He will be moderating tonight's night. He will make sure that we all stay on the somewhat straight and narrow while deviating a little bit to have a good discussion. I again want to thank you all for being out here at the Western Digital Milpitas campus, and I hope everybody will have a great night. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out. I'm not going to waste any time just talking myself. I think we should get our first wave of panelists out here. We'll start with, we have Miriam Sham, who's the head of public policy for Uber's self-driving cars division. We have Robert Grant, the vice president of government affairs at Cruise. Philippe Case is the CEO and founder of market research firm Topio Networks. Solomon Alam is the assistant general counsel here at Western Digital. That's the hometown welcome. And Brian Walker-Smith is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. The first thing, we're here to talk about the ways in which self-driving technology is going to be regulated, which I think right now still feels a little bit Wild Westy, Wild Western, Wild West, one of those. It's very much an open space. So, and I think that the people we have assembled here tonight might each take a slightly different view. But the first thing, Brian, I want to start with you. I want to ask, are there helpful precedents here for talking about how we regulate self-driving technology? Is this something totally new? Or can we say, oh, it's just like the telephone, but we've got to swap out these keywords?
Yeah, so every analogy is useful up until the point that it's not, right? So there are lots of lessons we can take from the past. One can go all the way back to railroads and then to consumer products and then to our modern consumer world where we say, look, companies with a lot of power need to have a lot of responsibility. Even if the risks they're introducing are not necessarily more than the risks of today, society kind of expects more from them. That's why we held railroads to a higher standard. That's why we held manufacturers to a higher standard. And frankly, that's why we're having this conversation, even though, well, we should be concerned about automated driving, we should be terrified about human driving. So I think that's one lesson, right? Another lesson historically, if you want,
please,
sure, is
history nerds.
you know, we're going to get things wrong, and we have to start with the recognition that the status quo is imperfect, and the history of technology, of policy, of engineering, of law is you take one set of problems, you replace them with a new set of problems, and you just really, really hope that your new set in aggregate is smaller than your old set. 120 years ago, internal combustion came around, and people said, this is great. We have solved our urban pollution problem forever. Because the urban pollution problem at the time was, yeah, I wasn't gonna say it. Yeah, you still have to eat, right? So horse manure? Yeah, average horse, 25 pounds of manure a day, 100,000 horses in New York City, that's a lot of manure. Fast forward 30 years and we realized that we hadn't solved that problem at all. So I think these are lessons that we can I think bring some humility to our regulatory exercise.
Rob, sorry. Is it fair to be held, like, do you think it's right that Cruise, Uber, these other companies developing this new technology, should you be held to a higher standard?
I don't think that's unfair. I think what we're trying to do is innovative. It is trying to solve for issues that Bryant has addressed, which there is a safety crisis on our roads now.
Mm-hmm. And all that manure.
Right, and all the manure. Well, it's
Sorry.
fitting that the question after manure gets to me. But yeah, I don't think it's unfair. I think what we want to do is to improve things, and if you're going to improve things, you have to show that you're doing it in a way that doesn't create additional hazards, right? If we're not solving for the issues at hand and we're creating new ones, we're not really adding anything positive, at least. So I don't think it's unfair that the standard might be higher. I think it should be done with reflection that the goal we're trying to get at is one that is good for everybody. So safety on the roads. In Cruise's instance, we use all electric vehicles, so getting at some of the pollution issues. So I think having some guidance from the government that yes, or regulations about this is how you should do it, but also realizing that the goal you're trying to get to is a worthy one, so that we shouldn't just artificially cut off or impose standards without reason or tangible connection to what the goals we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Miriam, I do want to ask you, as the representative of Uber, I know you're relatively new at the company. It's been about 1.5 years since the fatal crash in Tempe, and we just saw new documents from the National Transportation Safety Board that cast, frankly, like a pretty harsh light on Uber's, I think, safety practices. I think that's fair to say, that the car didn't know to look for pedestrians outside of crosswalks, maybe too much reliance on a single human driver, and not a particularly robust safety operations culture. So what has Uber changed since then? How are you addressing that?
An enormous amount. I'll start first by saying that we remain deeply, deeply regretful for the crash in Tempe, and immediately grounded our fleets everywhere that they were operating. We undertook top to bottom safety reviews, both internal and external by an independent entity. And we learned an incredible amount through this process, not only matters that we could address related to the crash, but indeed a broader suite of investments that we could make, not only with respect to the technology, not only with respect to the kind of organizational or operational safety considerations, the broader safety culture, but really importantly, and I think related to this conversation that we've been having, opportunities to provide greater transparency and access to information about the technology that we're developing. I think, as has so often been the case with big innovations throughout history, those that are on the cutting edge of that innovation, those that are developing, for example, self-driving technology, have a great deal of information about what we're doing. Regulators, the general public, even those in the communities where we're working and testing these vehicles, should have a great deal of information about what we're doing too. And so it's not only about the suite of investments in training, safety, drivers in.
And it's now back to two drivers in the car.
It is, absolutely. We're operating our vehicles for self-driving testing in Pittsburgh with 2 vehicle operators in the 2 front seats, and have enhanced their training programs, operational policies. But it's not just about doing that work, it's about talking about that work. It's about putting out regular reporting. It's about making really current information about our testing activities available on a website that's easy to find, so that those in Dallas or in San Francisco or in Toronto that may see our vehicles on the road, for example, mapping in full manual control by a human driver, understand that that's how those vehicles are operating, that they're not being driven by a computer or being driven by a computer with oversight from a human operator. So I absolutely believe that the safety investments that we've undertaken are important. They also must be paired, I think, with that transparency that I think lives up to the expectations, the higher standard that is, indeed in place for these kinds of new technologies.
Have you seen that, Bryant?
Yeah, so I'm really ambivalent on this point. I think necessarily the public, even regulators, are going to trust the developers of these technologies because they have no other choice. Government does not have the expertise or the resources that any one of these companies, much less all of them, has. They don't have access to the information necessarily. And so our whole regulatory model is necessarily premised on trusting companies. You look at the research and development budget of, let's say, 4 of the biggest automakers globally, it's about $40 billion. The advertising budget just in the US of 4 of the biggest automakers, $10 billion. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's budget for vehicle safety, $120 million. So a 100th of the advertising budget. It's just, it doesn't compare. And so given that we're necessarily going to trust, I think the question becomes who deserves that trust and how do they earn that trust? How does a company become and remain a trustworthy company? And in this case, a trustworthy corporate driver. The safety driver of the Uber vehicle was not driving the vehicle, in a legal sense perhaps, not in a moral or conceptual sense. The software wasn't driving the vehicle, Uber was driving the vehicle. And so I think Uber really did kill that pedestrian. And so the question then becomes, how do they earn that trust, right? Because you can necessarily trust a company once. What changes to have them earn your trust again? And certainly the steps you describe are a very important part of, I think, that ongoing conversation. In my view, what a trustworthy company is one that shares its safety philosophy, says, this is what we're doing, this is why we believe it's reasonably safe, and this is why you can trust us. And that's a constant process.
Mm-hmm. Can I take a different twist on the subject? I mean, so right now we're focused on companies, right? And I'm not part of a company, so I can take the advocacy for the companies. And the question to me is, so we're saying we're holding people accountable to a higher standard, but who fixed that standard, and what is it? Right? What is the standard that those companies should be accountable for? And you're asking the right question. You're saying, hey, there is a disconnect between the amount of money that is spent on R&D for those companies and what the government is spending on the same topic. But the question is, so right now we're saying we need to trust those companies, but the question is, do we spend enough as a government, do we spend enough in those technology in order to make the right calls? And my assumption is to say today, no. I mean, we don't. And we need to spend more money. We need to understand more things. And right now, I don't think there is enough leadership given by the government and by the people to help those companies make the right calls. So that's a little bit where I'm coming from is, we need more regulation, which, maybe not what we want to hear here in Silicon Valley, and the world is changing, right? So the last 20 years has been no regulation, and internet for everybody around the world, right? So for technology companies, and I've been a VC for 20 years, so I've funded a lot of companies in that space, so it's very good to have that type of environment. But we realize now that it's not a sustainable environment. We need more regulation. We need more people to actually understand what the effects are on people, that the stuff that technology is developing is doing. And we need more involvement of the government at a very early stage, not less, right? And thinking that by trusting a company, it's going to go better. I think it's going to go better until that company has a problem, and at that point, it's going to get worse, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think we should be trusting companies. I think we should be leading those companies and letting them know what we expect them to do.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add to the concept of whether or not, you mentioned are there standards and whether who's going to be doing the regulation. I don't think that you have a situation here, unlike other technologies, whether the internet or crypto, where the government regulator, depending on wherever you are in the world, is unsure about whether they should be regulating, right? That's not the conversation that's happening. The conversation that's happening is how the regulations should be implemented, and they're, at least here in the US, you have the Department of Transportation that's put out basically saying that the concept that it's going to be technology neutral, we're going to rely heavily on industry standard setting organizations as well as kind of outside groups that are going to put these together. What I think has to happen, to go back to the concept of trust, is that the individual companies themselves have to participate in the development of these standards and how that actually works, similar to how it does in other hardware contexts.
Open source, yep.
As an example. And so what you have is a situation right now where the companies themselves can earn trust by developing standards that are conceivably geared towards having a good relationship with their customer. If you talk about privacy, we talk about where the data is going to be stored, or how safe the vehicle is going to be, all of that stuff can be done prior to kind of the full-scale development, to the extent you have something in place and you have a vision in mind. And that's kind of the focus, I think, that as an industry we should be having.
You're making a good point that, if you're looking at crypto, right, you have all those consortia that are being put together to actually create standards. Mm-hmm. And we don't, do we see that in transportation? Do you work together to actually come up?
I think this is a really important conversation. It has been the case, if you look back at the kind of timeline of vehicle safety technology development, vehicle safety technology, including things like seat belts and airbags that I think, for example, take for granted today. These are technologies that in lots of ways industry developed, put in place, and regulation followed. And I very firmly believe in exactly what you're suggesting, that industry and regulators should be working together toward standardization and toward new and updated regulation. But industry is very much, I think, doing its part in having the right kinds of conversations. The AV Safety Standards Consortium, for example, that SAE has convened, has recently put out their first best practice and continues their work under UL around their kind of safety case approach. Underwriter Laboratories, apologies. UL 4600, looking at a kind of holistic safety case approach to developing self-driving vehicles. And we, I can say for Uber, have sought to seed some of that conversation ourselves. We've open sourced our draft safety case framework, very consistent, in fact, with the kind of approach that UL is taking but a comprehensive argument on vehicle safety, which really, to your point, Bryant, takes into account, not only the component level, the vehicle level, but the enterprise level. That is, that the company itself should be trustworthy, and there is a great deal, I think, of work to do in that space. But industry, I think, is having the right conversations and ensuring that those conversations dovetail with government regulation, legislation, is totally crucial.
Do you know? Do you know who you can talk to within the government? Do you have people that are assigned that you can talk to?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Absolutely. It's my full-time job to do that work. Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, I think. Sorry. Just on this point, within, and obviously looking forward to feedback from the other panelists. There isn't confusion about who is going to regulate this particular type of technology, right? I brought up crypto, for example, because with cryptocurrency, there was for several years confusion as to which part of the government should be regulating. Should it be the securities organizations? Should it be the FTC? I don't think that there's actually confusion about the Department of Transportation and its constituent other coordinates in other countries that are going to be doing that. So that, I think, has helped a lot put this forward. The question, again, is how to move that even quicker.
But it's a really different technology to regulate when we talk about the DOT, when we talk about NHTSA, which sets car crash safety standards. Figuring out how to regulate a self-driving car, that's like a quantum leap, right? And in changing that, so Rob, how do you talk to regulators and people in government about what Cruise is doing, and I guess what those guidelines or rules should look like?
Right, and I think this goes in response to Philip's point, which is nobody in industry, or at least Cruise, is not advocating against regulations. But it's really hard to ask a government to regulate a technology that it's not accustomed to, that ourselves as developers is still developing. And so, when you're talking about how does a perception system interact with a planning system versus the mapping system and the tracking system, and how does that come together and fuse with all the sensors, and what does the algorithm come through with an output? A lot of times we're dealing with regulators who have a very kind of functional basis, like, hey, we can go down and validate each function, which is, if you look at the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, is here's the function of brakes. Right, and here are 16 subparts about how we regulate brakes, and this is the test.
To use on the VIN.
Exactly. This is what you do. With electronic stability control. You have to turn the vehicle at this precise angle, at this precise speed, and see the reaction of the vehicle. We're now in a technology that is not as simple to do. And it's not something that they have been really familiar with doing. So a lot of what we go in and talk about, and I think there are very smart people in the government. That's not to say they're not. They are. But alongside us, who are on the forefront of this technology, they are still working their way through how exactly will this work? What are these are dynamic systems. They're not stochastic systems that, in the sense that you put in input and you get an output, right? There is an innumerable series of variables that could go into this. How do you capture that in a regulation, right? So you see these debates, whether it's here in the United States or overseas, about should you do scenario-based testing, should it be outcome-based testing? So I think it's just to get to your point and your point, which is this is not an industry that's saying don't regulate us. This is an industry that's saying, there's a lot that needs to be understood here. We're trying to educate everybody on what we're doing, but we're also learning as we go through this as well. And that goes to your point about trust. How do you build trust? So you are learning, and you're in this period of trying to understand what you put in as a code and how that will change what you see on the road, or what you simulate and how that will be seen on the road. How do you build that trust so that what you put out there is safe, and that the people that you're engaging in the real world understand that you've done it in a safe manner? That doesn't always mean, unfortunately right now, that it will always be a safe result. Hence why we have safety drivers in there. And so I think it's a little bit different frame than, hey, this is an open, unregulated internet of the future. These companies want to go in and discuss how to regulate this in the right way, but it is a different frame of mind than these regulators are accustomed to.
And that's a discussion that I don't want to cut short. And one of my concerns when we talk about this is that there's a push to saying, well, we need a standard, it needs to be at the national level and preemptive, and it means that there's a test. And I think each of those is incomplete. First of all, automated driving safety does not come down to a test, like a driver's test. It is everything from, as Miriam, you said, the enterprise philosophy, design philosophy, through standards integration, through various safety cases, through life cycle monitoring, all the way up to the point where all the shiny new technologies that we have today suddenly become ridiculously anachronistic. That's what safety means. And so in that way, safety isn't a one-time event. It's not a wedding. Safety is a marriage. It's a lifelong commitment. Right. The second,
just because we're also talking about technology that will start off maybe, I've got a self-driving car that can handle this part of San Francisco, and in 2 years I'm going to open it up to this part of San Francisco, right? This is technology that's going to keep evolving.
Absolutely. I think we're going to see the operational design domain, essentially the conditions under which the vehicles operate, being more the obvious limiter than any explicit measures of safety. And as you've pointed out, there's lots of variations. So just as we would not want any government to say, well, you need to have 2 LiDAR devices, they need to be positioned here and here on the roof, I don't think we would want a government to say, this is exactly how you go about making a safety case, or this is exactly what you do to demonstrate safety. Because we still need technical innovation, we need regulatory innovation, we need safety case innovation. And that needs to happen at the federal level. It also needs to happen in combination with local government municipalities that represent more community-based needs.
Salman, I want to ask you, I want to expand this a little bit beyond the raw question of, are these self-driving cars safe? Like, are they going to crash or not crash? We're also talking about enormous amounts of personal data kind of being moved around here, and maybe another area where the government isn't so used to knowing how to make rules around that. So how do you see that playing out? Like, what's the role of data in this regulation question?
Yeah, I mean, from a privacy point of view, this is going to be a pretty central question, right? Because you're going to have the amount of data that's going to be collected and stored and where it's going to be stored. All of these conversations are going to have to happen with the constituent drivers, of which there are going to be tens of millions of people driving these cars. I would just say that the best, in that space within privacy, there are a number of regulatory groups, agencies that actually think they regulate privacy, right? It's not like the Department of Transportation is basically saying that autonomous vehicles are our domain, this is how it's going to be, the same thing with other governments. So the conversation about privacy is actually not going to be that much different than the one that we're having right now, which is, do you have a relationship with the user where there is consent-based that's consistent with your understanding of what the user's expectations are about the data that you're collecting and how it's going to be stored? Because if that does not happen earlier, that doesn't happen now, you're going to be in the same place that some of the current technology giants are, which is basically waiting for regulation that may not be optimal, right? And that I think, and if there isn't that healthy conversation and relationship, that's actually going to be bad for the entire industry.
Is that kind of what we got in Europe with GDPR?
Yeah, I mean, with GDPR, the political kind of motivations for GDPR are kind of are their own area, but you have GDPR that went into place. GDPR, just for everybody, is the General Data Privacy Regulation that went into effect May 2018. That affects basically a significant amount of data that's collected online, as well as other offline pieces of information, covering everything from HR data to personal information online. What you have there, I think, is the European Union saying that if you're going to collect information about EU users, you're going to have to process it in a very specific way, process being defined very broadly. I don't see a real answer to that here in the US yet, or anything like that, even though there's talk of a general privacy regulation or general privacy law. And again, that's another question about whether that's going to be roped into autonomous vehicle data, and some would argue that actually may be a good thing. But you're going to have these various kind of balkanized areas of regulation if you don't have the right relationship with the user. And that's kind of what I would urge the people that are going to be making these OEM-based cars to make sure that we have that conversation.
Especially when the cities are asking the automotive company to share their data. Right? So you're in this situation where a lot of people are looking at that data saying, we want to have access to that data to do certain things. And so being able to create some type of a chain of trust of privacy so that you know that what Uber is going to sign with us is going to be maintained and respected by the cities and by the government and by everybody else. That's going to be very important in the near future in an environment where data, you're going to generate data everywhere. Your phone is generating data, your car is generating data, your home is generating data, and now we need to come up with a situation where all those companies have privacy policies. So you're signing those privacy policies, but they're sharing their data with other institutions. So how do you make sure that those institutions share their data? And that's kind of share their privacy, and that's a Facebook issue that we've seen. So we're going to see more and more of that in the future, not less, unfortunately.
It's interesting. We think about this from the point of view of, a lot of the data that will be collected is already data that is available and out there. If you're carrying a cell phone in your pocket when you're in a car, your geolocation data is known. Yeah. And so it's a lot of that data. It's really interesting in terms of when we talk about privacy, what data are we talking about? But I think you raise a really interesting concern, because what we've seen at the local level, and there's a major metropolitan city here in California that is pushing an initiative that says, we want every ride data, customized ride data on micromobility, so scooters and stuff like that. But we don't collect it. We give it to this third party that collects it and has all this data. And then it becomes a question of, well, who else gets access to that data? Now that the government has taken hold of, this individual, say you take a ride, it has who you are, when you picked it up, and where you dropped it off, and all this other stuff. They've collected it and they've given it over to a third party. What's the responsibility of the third party? What happens when the police come and say, hey, who are all the people that took a ride in this area at this time? If they came to us, well, we don't have customers yet because California doesn't allow it, so that's a whole other issue. We haven't gotten to that. But should they come to us, we'd say, hey, that's something that we would ask for a warrant for. Why do you have cause to ask for this information? If it's handed over to a third party, does that exist? So now you're creating this inequity where if you travel in your private car, you have more data security protections than if you do, say, in a cruise car or an Uber car. And that, for folks now who are much more aware of where their data is going, I think that's a disincentive to use certain transportation options.
But it's funny what you're saying that, because that's kind of the privacy, the difference between the privacy here and in Europe is here in the US, right? So if you're in your home and you're going through a window and you're naked, somebody can take a picture of you from the street, and they own that picture, and that picture can be public and can be published without your consent. So it's the same thing here, right? It's like if you're in a public car, whatever you do is going to be public. If you're in your own private car, it's part of your privacy and it's going to be private. Whereas in Europe, it's different, right? So the concept of privacy is different.
No, that's true. And the reasonable expectations around privacy are different in each, right? And that's a part of a cultural thing and also part of a longer dialogue on the development of law on each things that I'm sure Brian would love to give you a class on. But it's an interesting concept, right? As we talk about what's going on with the Facebooks and the social media platforms now, what is your reasonable expectation of privacy? And that's really been what's at debate here. Has it been transversed by these companies where you may or may not know what they're doing with your data?
Well, and in this case, right, you're going to be, if you look at what's going to happen in the future, you're going to be a lot of different things. You're going to do a lot of different things in a car, right, in an autonomous car. You could be working, you could be having a haircut. I'm making that up, right? But, there are a lot of...
business idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe start...
Exactly.
Yep.
I was going to say, I think that, we've talked a lot about safety. Safety, from our perspective, is the reason for the season. It's the reason to do the work that we're doing. I think we also have to acknowledge that there are also many other objectives for this technology and for the broader transportation sector. And when we think about data, we think about data sharing, and you think, setting aside Rob's more complicated example where you've got another third party, and they're put very simply, you have an individual that's using a service in the model, at least that we're pursuing. You have a city or a municipality that is in a position to enforce parking and traffic laws, et cetera. And you have a business like Uber or Cruise that is seeking to provide a service. And I think one of the things we've certainly learned is that when it comes to privacy, when it comes to safety, when it comes to information sharing, that it's really important that we're having pretty open dialogues about everyone's objectives and understanding where those overlap and where they may work against each other. And I think the reasonable expectation of privacy with respect to the consumer, cities are very interested, for example, in understanding how to plan their transportation systems going forward. And we're very invested in ensuring that both of those objectives are achieved. And how do we make policy that takes into account those shared objectives and not forget any of them?
Exactly. This is why I would talk about autonomy rather than just privacy, because that includes not just safety and security, but also your ability to act in the world.
Yes.
And your reduction in privacy can inhibit that. So to give an example, and of course I'll be wrong about this, imagine that you one day step into a street and cut off an automated vehicle. And using its sensors, the vehicle facially recognizes you, figures out, oh, that yes, this is Bryant, I have stepped out in front. And the next time I go to use that automated driving service, or maybe some other service on that platform, the company says, sorry, you're on timeout. You blocked our car. There's a consequence to pay. You don't get to use it. I mean, that's an example, however wrong it may be predictively, of the ways that data can implicate autonomy.
I want to ask about city policy levels, because we've talked a little about what national regulations could look like, what city level regulations could look like. I mean, cities are going to want different things. For Rob and Miriam, I mean, that sounds like an enormous pain. Like, do you have to create a different policy for every municipality that you operate in? How do you even think about that approach?
Yeah, I think we sort of had a conversation briefly about this before. You know, we're starting by having, I think, really important conversations with the cities where we're working now. And this is, you know, to your point in question, you know, understanding who the people are that we're working with, understanding who it is that we go to for help to ask our questions, and offering as much information as we can about what we're doing. And I think building those kind of neural pathways so that that is, you know, in the muscle memory and in the practice of the work that we're doing. And I think it's in that kind of engagement that we're learning exactly the set of objectives that I'm describing. You know, if your objective, for example, is to, as a city or a municipality, to ensure that there's transportation access for an area that may, for example, not have good access to public transportation, are there ways that we can work together, including given a business like Uber and the work that we're doing, for example, in partnership with public transportation operators and authorities? Is there a way that we can team up to ensure that the service that we're providing really complements that public transportation system, but delivers a really, really useful service that provides returns that we need and delivers on objectives for cities? So it's about working, I think, in the places where we currently operate when it comes certainly to self-driving, understand how it is that we engage, ask the questions about that objective set, understand the principled objectives from the city's perspective, and then figure out how we can partner to achieve them.
So we've got a little more than 5 minutes left. We have a poll question here that I'm not sure if we can maybe like get on the screen, where it's a system where you can text in your answer, and I'd be interested to hear what people say. And so I'd also like to, with 5 minutes, so like please go ahead and answer that. You know, and
Can I answer it?
yeah. But you know, take out your phone,
exactly.
do it like everyone else.
It knows precisely where I am.
I would like to open it up to audience questions. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I think we have a couple of mics floating around. Yeah.
Well, great panel, very insightful thoughts and ideas. One of the number one safety issues that I think everyone in the panel will agree to, is anti-temper, making sure that nobody can take control outside and drive it and crash it and do all that stuff. I think from data security, authentication, all the encryption, all the stuff, that's a huge area of development and regulation and all this stuff. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. How do we talk about hacking?
Right. Well, so at Cruise, this is a risk that we face every day, right? We have cars that are out on the road every day in the city of San Francisco. We have about 180 in our fleet that are testing there. So we think about this in a lot of ways, which is how do you reduce the surface area of the risk, right? How do you reduce internal intrusion? How do you reduce bad actors? So we take a series of methods to reduce the risk of cybersecurity. And so that includes everything from cryptographically encrypting messages between base and the vehicle, limiting the connectedness of the vehicles right now, not relying on external folks for connectivity issues. So there's a lot of what's going on, redundancy and separation of critical systems, so that if you get into one, you might not be able to bleed in the other. Obviously, you don't want that to happen to begin with. We also have hired a couple of really world-renowned white hat hackers to kind of test our system continuously. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Charlie Miller, but he's the one that hacked into the Jeep. He works with us and continually kind of pressure tests our cybersecurity resiliency. So we're doing a lot of things. This is kind of first and foremost among some of the risks that we are trying to address with innovating in this space right now. So I think the industry in general has a good history. Particularly, we're partnered with General Motors. They are part of the Auto ISAC, which is a group that, under the auspice of a specific White House order, allows companies and OEMs and non-OEMs now to share threats, to share learnings without fear of crossing kind of antitrust lines. So I think there's a lot being done in the industry right now to do that, to protect against that risk.
Do we have other questions? Yeah, we've got one down here.
Hi, I'm Robin.
Perfect.
Here it's like an autonomous car, everything sounds good, but then when the autonomous car runs on the street, now all the environmental factors has to be taken care of because on the perspective of insurance. So now in this way, how this autonomous industry is correlating with the insurance sector, because who is responsible if anything happens? Is it the developer who has developed the software? Is it the hardware on which that was running? Is it the car company, or is it the person? For example, I come in front of the car. Am I responsible for that? How all this are being correlated?
Thank you. Does anyone want to take on the question of liability? How do we assign?
Sure.
Yeah.
Vehicle sector.
Yeah.
Your entire environment should be controlled. Because tomorrow, nowadays, for example, in 880, if any accident or any construction happened, and if that scenario of that is not been modeled in your model, which has been running in your car, and something happens, how do you take that accountability? How that happens on the fly?
So imagine that you're driving today, I'm driving today, our cars collide. Who's at fault? Obviously you are, right? Because I'm on stage. No, I mean, the answer is it depends, right? We're going to say, well, were you speeding? Was I speeding? Who had the red light? We're going to look at all of these various facts. And that's going to be true of automated driving in instances of the future as well. There are going to be all sorts of circumstance-specific facts that are going to determine ultimately where liability is sorted out. Now, if you're the injured person, you're probably going to sue as many entities as you can, and they'll sort things out. And insurers will be an important part of that. Consumer-facing insurers don't want to be cut out of this market, so they're going to find creative ways. They're going to say, well, you know what? Your automated vehicle was a permissive driver on your policy. So you are still covered for the negligence of your vehicle of sorts. Laws about second best solutions. Will we blank slate things and solve it perfectly? No. Will law sort it out? Yeah.
The other thing is when you talk to insurance companies, they are worried about losing that business to the car companies, because as soon as you have enough cars, you can start self-insuring yourself. And so you're going to see those type of also blends. Where the car company are going to self-insure themselves across hundreds of thousands of cars.
Right.
I think as well, as the kind of safety benefits of this technology are proven out, the cost of insuring these vehicles could in fact fall.
Yes, exactly.
And as we think about improving transportation access, for example, it is the cost efficiency, not least in respect of the insurance cost, that is a significant offering, I think, of this technology.
Right. So more lawsuits, less insurance. I think we've got to leave it there. I just want to thank all of our panelists. Oh yeah, so let's look at that. I think, is anyone here surprised by these answers?
I think it makes sense, right? Yeah.
I'm encouraged. I think
Likewise.
this is a pretty educated group, so the numbers are actually better than what we tend to see in the generic public.
Okay, so that's got to
But
be
I think it's a
encouraging.
matter of being informed. I think, and that's partly what we do every day, is try to inform people of
And
everything.
we've grown to see those cars, right? So we feel more comfortable with them because we're seeing them all the time.
Indeed, and you can see that in the surveys as you look at surveys around public opinion on AVs. Those same surveys that are conducted in places where testing is becoming almost ubiquitous, places like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for example, you see very different results, I think, than you see from the general population. So thank you.
Familiarity breeds comfort.
It does.
So I want to thank all of our panelists.